Hello and welcome to what I believe is the 66th RPG Book Club, Pillars What Remains, a tabletop role-playing game of identity and endurance. Now this appears to be a largely plain text document, which certainly isn't a problem, especially for a playtest. I know from what I've heard from the initial post of it that it involves multiple players playing as or controlling one character. I don't know how precisely you describe that. Yeah, it's about, I think, 30 something pages long. So I don't know, how much of the preamble stuff like this I'll be reading, but from this I gather it's some kind of post-apocalyptic thing to an extent. Though that statement is a little harder to interpret with the current context that I have. Was designed and written by Night Danger Games, created by HM. Relatively standard there. Now, it starts out with what maybe you would call an example of play, or maybe more like a story that would sort of be created in game, which is a bit unusual, but not too much so. That's another thing that I saw in the original post, that the collectively controlled character is a courier of some sort. Alright. Definitely a lot more information I can gather about the setting from this. There are clearly some kind of monsters or creatures in it, but there's apparently no longer magic despite having magical adjacent creatures. Yeah, more stuff about the past potentially changing, though whether it's just memories or directly things that actually happened in the past remains to be seen. Yeah, so far, it's definitely not fully an example of play, but you could understand how a lot of this might arise from play. This is a little more complicated to see how it would arise from a particular game, this sort of interlude about her father slash backstory. That's something more common in a more traditional story, but there may be something in the way the system works that actually reflects stuff like this. We'll have to see. Yeah. So that's sort of interesting. Not sure what that means yet as well. Yeah, a lot of stuff about the past sort of coming back into play in the present, and I don't know how literal that is for the system yet. Interesting. You know, how that sort of affects the way she interacts with the past, and that has an effect on the world. That makes it seem less metaphorical, but it certainly still could be. It could all actually be stuff happening internally. Okay, and looking at the table of contents, another step doesn't really tell me what that section is going to be about. This is about the gamer is another step what I just read. Yeah, okay, that makes more sense. So, this is some sort of introduction to the game, some introduction to the collective character, the rules in more details. Okay, very nice. And this sort of seems to be the entirety of the, what do you call it? The sort of structure of the game, how it begins and resolves laid out to an extent. Maybe not how it begins, but most of the mechanics / story elements, and then the end. And then you get to setting information after the character sheet, advice, inspiration, random tables, glossary. It all seems like the table of contents more or less, or rather the organization of the book makes sense based on the table of contents, and this would make things relatively new, easy to navigate. It's not clear where you would learn about how to start the game from this, per se, but it seems pretty obvious that that would either be in the About section or the beginning of the rules, though perhaps it would be there. So, that's maybe a minor complaint, but it probably doesn't matter. Alright, I'm back. Here's the summary. Yeah, collectively embody a single character who is a courier and delivers messages. Yeah, post-magical is the descriptor they're using specifically. Okay, so there is a definitive flashback mechanic. I think I'll just read this entire paragraph. A unique tabletop role-playing game where players collectively embody a single character, a courier, who delivers messages to the scattered remains of civilization in a post-magical wasteland. Each player is responsible for one pillar, a mental aspect of the courier defined narratively and mechanically through flashback memories. This shared history is put to the test as the courier endures the physical challenges of the wastes alongside the dark echoes of their past it manifests. Yeah, so it looks like there's definitively past coming back physically as well as just internal stuff. We play to answer 2 questions. Will the courier survive their delivery? If they do, and if they do, will they still be the same person as when they started? Alright. So this, I think, is something I probably need to read over again. Okay. So the players are pillars or mental aspects of the main character, and they are defined through flashbacks. Yeah, flashback memories. So it's not like each pillar, while these mental aspects are separate and likely have different purposes, there's not one specifically assigned to memory, say, and they are all connected to memory. So it may sort of be more like elements of personality and past than sort of different parts of the brain, per se. It depends on how you view that. Okay, and the goal is, to succeed and to see what that changes about the main character. Inside Out meets Annihilation is an interesting descriptor. I've seen one of those. I'll let you guess which one. Okay, 4 players. Yeah, it's intended for one-shots. Yeah, this is maybe random, but I kind of would like a figure that represents the full number. It's technically 3 to 5 players, and even though that's clearer, clearer if you're reading carefully at all, I think, 3 to 5 players, one of whom is a GM, is just better to me than one GM and 2 to 4 players. Because, this doesn't really have the overall number of players unless you do math. It's incredibly easy math because it's just +1, but still. Okay, creative high stakes problem solving using original dice mechanics. So, narrative focused game and problem solving, which aren't always things that go together that smoothly, so we'll see. Encounters that test both the physical endurance and personal identity of a shared character. And the final confrontation between the courier's persona and their hollow, deciding what remains the self. That's definitely interesting. So if it's sort of that literal of a, replacement with an alter ego as a potential thing, I would think, I think answering the question of will they still be the same person as when they started isn't really accurate. It's not about just exploring whether they'll stay the same. It seems like based on it being a final confrontation, there's a definitive goal to overcome this hollow, and that sort of characterizes it more about physical and mental victory/survival rather than just survival and then potential change. And I think this last one is a little misleading to what's really intended. Town setting, cultural touchstones include. Yeah, it didn't include Inside Out on this one, though, for some reason. Interesting to see how sort of Memento-style things will come into play. Yeah, I don't know a ton about Disco Elysium. Heard about House of Leaves, but never really looked into it, really, or Earthsea. No idea what that one is, this one. Station. Interesting to include. Music stuff. Maybe I'll listen to those later. Okay. I tell you what you'll need to play. That's always nice. Okay. I really don't like the way this is written. Basically, it's just a digital or physical character sheet, I think, but they say a shared medium, digital, or paper for players and the GM to contribute to a bespoke character sheet. That's complicated and kind of confusing and sounds more like a pencil or a paper to me. I mean, I guess medium would probably more be a paper, but it's just, this is a little overwrought, I feel. Yeah, and then polyhedral dice. It would be interesting to consider why the discovery of, magic being exhausted led to an increased use of magic. And that's not me saying that doesn't make sense. Definitely does make sense. That's how things go a lot of the time. But it's not so self explanatory that, it doesn't raise questions. I'm not saying that as a complaint or anything, it's just interesting to consider. But I don't know if exploring the history of the world is really something this game focuses on or not. Okay, divide a civilization into insular pockets. Okay, interesting. Even after the war, and things were relatively separate, it seems magic overuse continued, and nature twisted and stuff as a response of magic leaving everything. All makes sense, except that specifically the twisting of nature seems to be focused on waste, when you would think the overuse and sucking out of magic would be focused on the areas of civilization where people are to use magic. And once again, that's not an abject flaw or interesting, it's just something that initially appears incongruous. Okay, the waste inflicted a dreadful incoherence on the minds of those who passed through it, splintered, passed through, and violently transformed. It's interesting that it began to affect smaller and smaller parties. I'm not sure why that would be. Okay, so it's sort of just a mechanism to explain why you have to cross alone. Tenable. Okay, very interesting. It's a good explanation for why the group always plays a single lone character. That, it doesn't inherently. It's not an inherent reason provided for why things happen that way. It's just the result of it is interesting and explains the premise of the game. Okay, trade, conflict, impossible, and communication. Now this definitely implies that there is not a better means of communication than foot travel by one person. And obviously the groups largely explains that. It also explains, why there isn't messengers by bird, because animals get twisted by the wasteland. The one question is some form of technology or magic. Why that isn't used, magic is probably largely gone by this point. As for technology, that implies that, it's a relatively low-tech setting, which I don't know that has been definitively established at this point. Yeah, but past descriptions such as glittering fantasy, great kingdoms, definitely make it sound more like, medieval or Renaissance style fantasy than anything futuristic, so that does check out. As there being not a high enough level of technology for communication to really be easy without just sending someone across the waste. Now, there's the question of what kind of messages are being sent and why. If trade is impossible and war is impossible, the idea of nations really coordinating very frequently for much purpose seems limited. Perhaps separated families are trying to reach each other. But at this point, it seems like it would have been long enough for even that to not be that likely. These cities are so isolated that it will be interesting to figure out what kind of messages are being sent when messages and inefficiently are the only things that can be sent, what their purpose is, and things such as that. Like phrases like defiant act of connection do make it seem like it is not necessarily deeply purposeful to send these messages other than for the sake of maintaining that connection, but I definitely want to see if they provide examples of what messages might be sent, because that seems like it would be an important detail of the game in the session you're playing, but it hasn't really been discussed yet. It's about delivering messages and the effect that has on the deliverer, but no real mention of what kind of message is being delivered or how that affects anything. And that's not necessarily bad for a summary, but it does potentially present the idea that the message won't really be involved at all, which I think would be a waste. Again, a summary not involving the message doesn't mean that, but that's a possibility in my mind at this point. Career. Okay, so character creation occurs during the game. Okay, and even the specific job or letter is not defined at the beginning. Once again, what the actual message is isn't even really referenced. So that makes it so, given that it's a courier in the waste, the fact that they were able to see their old house means that probably not as much time has passed as I initially thought. Because I thought maybe it would be a couple generations since things were cut off at least, but it seems like this might be supposed to be taking place relatively soon after, or at least not a full generation after couriers became necessary. Okay, that's a very interesting description, I think. Though somewhat optimistic, perhaps, of what will typically be written. Okay, something that each player does need to decide at the start of the game, good to know, is which pillar they are going to inhabit. So this is sort of where it starts describing, how play, or the preparation for play actually begins. Yeah, I'd have to look more about how this section is written to really be sure, but it might be worth having a separate subheading for what the pillars are under this, so that's easy to locate in the table of contents and reference back to. Think about these pillars as the core parts of the courier's personality. Okay, memories are called drives. But memories is italicized like it's a term in and of itself. Okay, so the mechanical advantages are the drives. For a second, I thought it was saying these memories are the things called drives. Suppose the writing could be clearer, but that's probably mostly on me. I figured it out in a couple seconds. Okay, roleplay through the lens of their developing pillars, adding motivations, tensions, action, resolution. Yeah, so that really is not something I can understand at this point. It probably needs to be split up and described a bit better, because right now, reading it, it doesn't read as something that makes much sense. Let me read it out loud. As much as possible, players are encouraged to roleplay through the lens of their developing pillars added motivation. Developing pillars, probably a comma there, should be adding motivation, tension, action, and resolution to the courier's increasingly complex character. It's just not really clear how, the start of this really connects to the second part or anything. Okay, benefit from acting in accordance to their drives. Unique and interesting drives, so the drives are things that are created. Okay, but there are suggestions. Form of a verb, so a drive is a verb. It's a characteristic of what they can do and what they're compelled to do. They are motivation forces for the decisions and actions of each player. Now, in a game where it kind of seems like you control so little, like you only even control part of one character, adding an additional separate word that is supposed to dictate that control sort of further focuses what a player is supposed to do to the point that it kind of seems like it might be limiting a player's choice in how they want to roleplay. Like, not only are you not really the character in full, but you're supposed to act according to, a separate principle from yourself. Almost like it kind of seems like the drive is more the pillar than the pillar itself is at that point. Okay, yeah, don't cleanly fit together or may be contradictory. The gameplay benefits of drives to demonstrate the growing complexity of the courier through the actions of the world is key to the rich storytelling in the Game of Pillars. That's another sentence that does not really make a lot of sense. Like, what does this directly mean? Like, I'm not sure how the gameplay benefits of the drives would demonstrate any of that. The gameplay benefits might encourage you to use drives and therefore end up having those drives being represented and adding to complexity, but it's not clear how the gameplay benefits themselves would, and even if that was the case, it's just sort of a confusing sentence. Okay, relying on the past has dangers. Every time pillar uses a drive to motivate an action. They mark 1 drift on it, measure of the waste distortion. When a drive reaches 3 drift, the pillar will be confronted by an echo of the memory that formed it, potentially warping it permanently. Warping the pillar or the memory or both. The courier undertakes their journey with a somewhat standard set of traveling equipment. Okay, clothing for various climates, rations, shelter making, fire building supplies, and a weapon or 2. Find, but as the courier overcomes challenge experience memories, it should become more personal and specific to the courier. Okay, interesting. Like, I'm assuming this is something like, just a tent might become a cut and frequently patched tent and be more rich in description that way. That's probably something you should provide an example for. And again, this is sort of a separate thing that would be good to reference back to. It would be good to have a way to reference back to, what sort of thing a character starts with, just from the table of contents. And I guess you could figure that out just from the courier heading, but there's a lot of, stuff about sort of the philosophy of what a courier is and what you don't do yet at the beginning that makes it hard to separate the more clear things to actually define as a player, such as starting equipment and pillar selection that should be marked out in some way, I feel. Okay, courier relies on 2 resources to survive: strain and fracture. Like here, now that we are getting into the 2 resources you need and what the pillars are, and examples and perspective and all that stuff, and we've just finished traveling equipment, there should be, a little thing that marks out traveling equipment like there is for resources and 4 pillars to choose from. And this whole sort of section with the actual meat of what you do for being a courier rather than just the overall description should have its own subheading that appears in the table of contents for easy navigation. You could also say that each of these things should be marked out on the table of contents, like strain and fracture, 4 pillars to choose from, approach. Should all be marked out in the table of contents separately, but that's probably a little overkill. I think you would just need, starting equipment to be part of this set of sections and the overall thing to have a heading. Alright, looking at strain and fracture. So this is interesting because what decreases over the course of the session is their maximum strain, and then individual conflicts increase their current strain. Instead of their strain increasing or decreasing overall over the entire journey. The amount of strain they can handle overall increases, and then strain increases in individual conflicts or whatever, and resets after them. Fracture we've heard about before, and that represents mental damage on the pillars themselves rather than the character that is composed of those pillars, so to speak. And you can have 3 max. And as you fail during echoes, it resets to 0 after each echo, yeah. But I wanted to go back, and because I think these have already been mentioned, and see that. Nope. Because I know there was like a set of 3 things mentioned earlier. Okay, no, so there's drift. So you can have 3 drift on a pillar, well, on a drift technically. And that leads to an echo, which then you can have 3 fractures within that echo. So it's a separate set of 3 things. I thought, based on what I remember, fracture might have been the thing involving 3 we talked about already, but that was a separate thing. Okay, values. Okay. So it sounds like at the cost of adding drift to all their drives and not getting straight on failure, they can potentially reduce strain. So that seems like a relatively high cost to a potentially low benefit, but we'll have to see how things shake out. What I wanted to look back on. It's not really clear when you decide what values you pick. Or I guess, it's the drives that you pick. When does it say explicitly what time you pick drives? So you use memories to create drives, potentially. But your memories aren't created at the beginning, which implies that your drives aren't created at the beginning. It's not really clear when you select drives, quote unquote, because it never really directly talks about that, it seems. Like, I know it said create or pick from a table of drives at one point, but it doesn't really say when or how. Yeah, so you can use memories to create drives, but there's also a list of selections, but it's not clear when any of that selection or creation happens. Alright, moving on to perspective. No, not perspective. I think I was on approach. So it looks like you might decide the memories for these, or... Okay, just the memories that have constructed their world. Okay, so this one just gives you more of an advantage on roll for adding one to all your drives. When I see how do you solve problems, I more think about what kind of solution you attempt rather than how do you figure out what solution you want to use, which is, most of what this is. So this seems somewhat similar to this other one, on that you add drift to your drives to get a better chance of success. I couldn't tell you which one, would be more beneficial in what situation. And so this one seems to be the one that mainly refers to what actions the character will actually take. This one's kind of interesting. It increases your chance of success, and if you fail, removes strain. So that might be the best one, potentially. But what you've got overall is values, which is sort of moral stuff, or just what's important. How you approach things, how you view things, what you want. That seems like a fine spread of things to do, at least if you're going with 4. Then maybe there's some overlap with approach and perspective.
Okay. This is interesting because although the waste can alter memories in certain ways and manifest things from them, even potentially, it looks like the act of memories appearing before you, or flashbacks, is just a function of the travel itself. Okay. So there's one player setting the contents and intention of the scene, and then the GM and other players are NPCs, which leaves the question of who exactly is controlling the main character, which in a flashback, you'd think at least one person has to be doing that. At least if every other player is, playing their own NPC, who's playing the main character? Yeah, so this is probably when drives are selected then. It talked about memories being related to drives before, but this sort of confirms it. You probably want to confirm it earlier, because, if you provide a desire that players are supposed to select and then a random table like this, people are going to assume you're supposed to pick from that table at this point. One detail of the present circumstances. Okay. At the outset of the courier's first journey, every pillar creates their first memory. And then each player creates a memory after the first and second encounter. Okay. Okay, so you can't decide why you're on the journey until the very end, which is interesting. We're seeing a memory in play before it's really been described that much, I think. I don't know how to feel about that at this point. So it does seem, while the pillars, focused on their pillar in terms of how they control the character, ultimately the person responsible for the memory is the one controlling the character in that memory, which, isn't really established by this. so there's like really for this, I think an example of possible drives that could be chosen
would be good for demonstration purposes. They're obvious. There are two obvious points of what you could select for this, which is either whatever desire caused her to go toward the bushes instead of paying attention to the storm initially, or, her sister protecting her having created a desire for that kind of protection, or her sister directly after the fact. I think you definitely need more context for this on how this changes play and relates to things and such. Though perhaps that will be this, aspects of this will be got back to in later examples. But in and of itself, it's not a super interesting story, and it doesn't really tell you how it's going to affect things going forward in isolation. So I don't know that it's an example that is that just that interesting overall. I mean, it's not objectionable, I would say, but you want to use this opportunity to demonstrate how you can tell interesting stories in the system, or how the stories you tell really affect the system on a deep level. Without either, it's kind of just there. Animated is an odd choice of words. Okay, requires interaction from all players and are meant to be tense. So it looks like it gets harder as you go on. Roll under a target as die size increases during drives. So that makes it sound kind of automatic. I'm still not sure how exactly drives benefit things specifically. Attempt to roll under a target as die size decreases using drives. So I guess it's a collective roll, because otherwise, a d12 is always going to be under 30. Let me see if I can understand this a bit better, because it's fairly confusing, I feel. So, skill challenges start with the highest die, a d12, and players attempt to roll under a target as the die size decreases using drives. Okay, still don't really know what that means. Force challenges start out with the lowest die, a d4, and players' rolls accumulate towards a total as die size grows using drives. What's confusing about this is mentioning a total here, but not a total here. Makes it seem like this is not involving a total at all. In which case, you'd think you'd automatically succeed any tense. I'm also not sure how, even with die size decreasing, you'd ever get under a brutal at 1. So, yeah, this is confusing. this is a little more immediately easy to understand how you might get through it, but I'm still not really getting the context of how long this takes, or whether drive's automatic or not, or what, and what the turn order of players' rolls is, stuff like that, unless they all roll at the same time. Okay, die size improves when a player's actions aligns with one of their drives, otherwise the die size stays the same between actions. And each time they use a drive, mark off one drift on it. Drive accumulates its third drift, it triggers an echo, drift is cleared after each encounter. Well, it's good that there's some kind of cost, because that, sort of mitigates the desire to just act however you want and say it aligns with the drive, because, when you're using player created words, potentially, they can be very open ended. Okay, every roll that does not bring a success adds a strain. Okay, and reaching maximum strain is the end. Yeah, maybe this involves subtraction in some way. I'm still not really sure how that's supposed to work. Yep. Okay, the way maximum strain decrease is actually influenced by the strain that was accrued. So that's not something I realized. That's kind of interesting. Encounters have 3 separate conflicts. The beginning, middle, and end thing is nice, I suppose. Okay, so going back a minute. There's 3 encounters, 3 conflicts within each encounter, 3 memories, 3 strain you can accrue, and 3 fractures you can accrue. So 3 is really an important number. But going all the way back toward the beginning, yeah, so creative high stakes problem solving. This is again, this goes back to my earlier point about how a narrative focused game can be at odds with problem solving in some situations. When I hear problem solving in a RPG, particularly creative problem solving, I'm thinking of the way players try and figure out how to solve a problem and the actions they take having an influence on how that solution works. Like, I'm thinking of some kind of analysis and critical thinking. So far, the only factors that seem to influence roles are whether you act in alignment with your drives, which is not really a matter of being analytical. It's just having a value that you're supposed a value as in a ideal or something that you're supposed to act in line with, and as long as you do that, you get an advantage. There's no real of the, there's no real thinking or analysis or practicality that I would connect with, creative problem solving so far. It's entirely narrative focused how you solve problems and not, actually problem solving IRL. So that's just something to note, but maybe that will change as I get more information. Okay. Each encounter features 3 conflicts, and each one gets harder, maybe? Okay, it can be any order. Okay, and skill or force. Okay, so it was always conflicts, not encounters, that have the difficulty. And while this heading is encounters and conflicts, it doesn't really look like. Yeah, encounters are really defined to begin with. Yeah, like conflicts are sort of equated to encounters in this initial descriptive paragraph rather than it being specified that conflicts are, individual things that occur during an encounter. Yeah, the only part in this huge box that seems to reference encounters at the end, and we don't really have what encounters are until you get all the way down here. So encounters should probably be defined closer to the beginning of the encounters and conflict section, especially since of the sort of wider category. Encounters are composed of conflicts, so you would think that encounters are sort of defined first. Okay, skill. Proficient in cunning or wits. Doing so means carefully considering the problem and trying to solve it with a decisive action, but nothing here really indicates the solution you choose matters at this point. Okay, set a skill number of 3, 2, or 1 representing the difficulties respectively. Okay. Describe an action their pillar will motivate the courier to take and roll a d12. It sort of is difficult to consider how values, as described as being a mainly morality thing, would apply to each, conflict that a player encounters. But, you can describe values in a way that is less morality focused and it might make sense. Okay. Take and roll a d12. Rolling the skill number or lower is a success. Okay, so it's meet or beat as in going under, not just beat. Which, is different than the beginning description in a lot of ways. Like, this goes from 30 to 20 to 1, but it looks like it's just supposed to be 3 to 2 to 1. Maybe these are supposed to be bullets, like before tough and brutal, but there's no bullet before tense. So this is definitely written in a way that, does not make a lot of sense, though. If I had really thought about this, this is obviously not 160, so I should have figured that out earlier. These were not 30 and 20. Yeah, but anyway, it's not just to roll under, it's to roll at or under, basically. That's another part of why this is not written great. Okay. Respectively. Turn and quarter, take their turn, describe an action. Rolling the skill number or lower is a success. The plan works and the conflict is resolved on a success. Any higher and you add 1 strain. Physical, emotional, or mental setback, and the play passes to the next player. The player then describes their action. If it is in line with one of their drives, the die size improves to a d10 and they mark off a drift on that drive. If it does not, they roll a d12 again. Yeah, it looks like you can't use a drive on the first attempt, which is interesting. Like, it makes sense mechanically because, it's strange to decrease the die size before you've hit the initial, maximum die size. However, it is a little odd narratively that you can't act in line with how your pillar would expect you to or motivate you to from the beginning. Okay, and if you get 3 drifts, that's an echo on that pillar's next turn, but that assumes they have a next turn, or like if your turn, would that be, yeah, I would assume it occurs even in the next conflict, because I think drift might be one of the things that resets, but if you get to 3 drift and the conflict is resolved, or the encounter is resolved before your next turn, does that mean the echo just doesn't happen? Yeah, but looking at this, with a d12 and a numbered hit of 3, I think that's like a 1 in 4 chance at the beginning on the easiest difficulty, a 1 in 6 on the medium, and a 1 in 12 on the hardest. So on the... maybe I said that wrong. No, I didn't. Okay, so the best odds you're going to have at immediate success are a 25% chance, which is fairly good, really. And strain can go up to 20. So you want, at most an average of 7 strain or 7 attempts per conflict. Though, of course, the higher you get, the more your overall max strain is decreased by, but this definitely seems very doable. Actually, do drifts reset or not? Because you can definitely, cycle drifts to make things a lot easier. Okay, so skill, can be resolved with a single roll, as I've stated, but are never guaranteed. I guess that is different with the other option. And you can push things. An interesting descriptor there. I wonder if all these days are supposed to be from the same person. I'll probably have to look back at some point. I'm on page 9. I want to see if drifts do reset because I feel like I've seen something about that, but okay, so fracture is the thing that resets. That's where I was getting that from. I'm guessing strain doesn't. No, strain also resets. It does seem to me like it would be a little hard to get to 3 strain on a drive. Well, actually, no, you only start out with 1 drive because you've only encountered 1 memory at that point. So yeah, with 1 drive, that's a lot more understandable, but you'd have to choose to do that 3 times over 3 conflicts. Let me think. We've got a... So for you to do that, basically, you would have to choose to do it every time and have 3 to 4 turns, which means 1 turn per conflict at least. Which means overall, assuming you've got a party of 4 players, that means 4 pass attempts. So the max that would be added each time is maybe 3. Nothing I'm saying is really making sense, I'm sure. Because it's hard to really quantify how I feel this, but it does seem like it would be really difficult to get to max. What's the thing on a max drift? Okay, I confused drift and strain. Yeah, okay, strain resets. So I just completely confused terms. Yeah, strain resets, fracture resets. Strain and fracture resets, but drift does not reset. Okay, so that doesn't matter. I confused myself. It did seem like drift resetting would be kind of lenient, but it does not reset, so that point is moot. As for strain, when you've got a max of 20, which won't be the case the whole time, it'll get more difficult as things go on. It does seem unlikely that you're going to hit that at the first challenge, or rather the first encounter overall, but that is essentially a good thing. You don't want it to be particularly likely to fail at the first hurdle. Okay. That player then describes the action their pillar will motivate. Okay, so you roll, and then you roll again? Yeah, I think it's supposed to be the next player, not that player. Yep. Yeah, so every player's roll is added together in order to reach the force number set by the GM. I think is a little bit of an odd phrasing and definitely shouldn't be this far down when it's sort of the core mechanic of this. Especially with the phrasing of chipping away at the problem. I think it actually just makes more sense to subtract, whatever roll you get from the force number and just keep going that way than to keep up a running total and compare it. Yeah, and since this is, something that is being chipped away at over time, you should also note that after each roll, it should be described how that contributes to the solution. Yeah, when the strain is described narratively by the DM, the GM, it should also be noted that it should be described how the problem is being to an extent lessened despite the quote unquote failure, because that's what's happening. Like, say, breaking down a door, it's easy to consider how you would describe it getting more and more broken. A predator outrunning them, it does seem a little harder to describe if specifically you want the strain to be in the form of damage from that predator that is occurring throughout. But if you just want strain to be a lessening in stamina that if it overflows causes you to collapse or something and then get eaten, you can easily just describe how you're getting further and further away from the predator even on bad rolls. Or you could describe how the predator's stamina is decreasing even as the player is, and that makes it more independent from how close the predator is. So the predator can be closer or farther depending on the rules, and the consequences can be in line. But ultimately, there is still something that you are making progress in this case, out stamina-ing the predator rather than directly outdistancing it at that point. But going back to how this sort of isn't described well, yeah, determine a turn order. The first player takes their turn, describe an action, roll a d4. Yeah, and whether as it is part of the result of the roll, whether it is accomplished through adding or subtraction, at this point it should be described, I think, how the result of the d4 applies to the total, and, how the problem lessening is described. These should both also be in there, or this should be split into two separate blocks of text to accomplish that. And then this needs to be corrected where that player then describes their action, and it needs to be changed to the next player. Yeah, okay, and this is something. Yeah, this is something that is actually also in the first description, where it just goes from the first player to that player, which implies it's the same player all just acting over and over again, which I'm pretty sure is wrong. So that phrasing should be changed. I'm trying to remember something I wanted to keep track of that I think I forgot mainly. I think, I wasn't sure whether these conflicts would, and how their approach would make sense overall. I think it's fine, but the wording is a little confusing descriptively. If I'm understanding how it's supposed to work, I think it'll work. It's not quite written right in a couple places, as I've said. Yeah, and another thing I'd like is some mechanism so that both kinds have to be chosen at least once. But, maybe that's not something that really matters, but, just personally, if there are, two ways of solving something and there are dedicated rules for each one, I'd kind of want a way to make sure both are used at some point. But that might just be me. Yeah, so this, even if you are, doing things, if you're increasing drive every time, even, and getting max rolls, it will take 2 failed attempts to get by the easiest difficulty of this. And since you can always roll a 1, this is unlikely, but since you can always roll a 1, you could go up to, 16 attempts. Let's go for something more conservative and say that you're not increasing die size, but always getting an average roll. So, always more or less a 2. Well, let's be generous and say 3, but you never increase die size. And that would take 5 failures to get by. So either way, it seems like, you're not really going to be developing that much strain for these.
No.
Moving it up to 24, let's say die size was increased twice in relatively average rolls. You get 2 and 3, which is 5. And then after d6 is a d8. So that's 4, that would be 9. So you would have 9 in the first 3 attempts, and then after that, it'd be 13, 17, 21. Yeah, and that would be, I think, 6 failures, right? Let me redo that math. 2, 5, 9, 13, 17, 21. So, even if you don't use drive too much and get relatively average rolls, a 24 will probably be completed within 6 strain, which isn't bad. But comparing to skill challenges, it's hard to say, but I don't know enough about probability to know how relatively easy or difficult it would be get to do the hardest level here. Like, a 1 in 12 chance. That's would definitely potentially take a lot of attempts, a lot more than 6 maybe, to get a 1. Though on the other hand, maybe for D12 there's a 50% chance that you get a 1 in 6 attempts. I don't know if that's how that works. It might be, it might not be. But once you're decreasing the die size each time, supposing you do that, or just doing it twice for the sake of comparison, would go down to like a 1 in 8 chance. Yeah, so it definitely seems like I could be wrong about this, but I feel like on average, it will probably take more attempts to get through the highest difficulty for skill than for force. And that's overall the way it should be, because for force, on the highest difficulty, it takes at least 3 attempts, whereas for skill, you can, in theory, get through it on 1 attempt. So, for these two categories, it should definitely be one you can get through quicker, but it's more likely to take longer. And I think that is being preserved mathematically based on relatively average things, but I'm not really that good at math, so I really couldn't tell you. That's something the developer will have to check on their own. But it seems to be being preserved. Okay, a single pool of strain, yep. And ends at max. It would be interesting to note the different ways that this can happen, because you could obviously just die, but the ways could also, warp your character in certain ways. Maybe just mentally or even mutating them, but I think that will probably be covered in endings. We'll have to see. Yep. Okay, yeah, and you might want to. This is generally good advice. It doesn't give instructions for how exactly to split that from between players, but I don't think that's really necessary since it's not a main feature of the game. As well as this, though, the current circumstances are also potentially determined by memories, so as well as the option of describing routes between encounters, during a memory, a player might say what their character is currently, what landscape they're currently in. Like, okay, so physical description. I think I confuse that with physical description of their location at a memory. Yeah, the present circumstances of the courier. I feel like that is a bad way of phrasing this. Because, sure, it's technically stuff that applies to their present, but, stuff like their name and place of origin probably wouldn't have changed, including connections to others, so it's not really present circumstances being described. I would say that's written, incorrectly. It's more about the character or their backstory overall. So it does look like the only way, despite in examples of play, you know, like in examples of play, though, I feel like multiple times the location is referenced at the beginning, the present location, but all the examples for details of present circumstances are entirely focused on the courier themselves, so that's a little inconsistent. And then there's also the option of describing the route between encounters. Okay. So it's hard to say how this sort of directly acts in line with desires, but that doesn't really matter necessarily because it's not an attempt to access a drive. Okay, so what happens is described here, and that strain is decreased is described here, but why strain is increased or how it is increased is not exactly described. Like, it's easy to assume when Hannah realizes she's backed herself into a corner, and Hannah, it does seem to be a consistent character being used in these examples, but anyway, when she realizes she's backed into a corner, the strain increasing is likely from stress due to this. However, that is not being explicitly mentioned, and I think it really should be. When you're describing how strain is added, it should be important to note what the strain exactly is. 10 out of a maximum of 17. So they really aren't in that bad a situation. Like, unless. Actually, going back a bit, I said that, I'd like there to be a way for it to be made sure that both force and skill are attempted at some point. But for some reason, I was thinking that you would pick one overall per encounter, not per conflict. With, there being 9 total conflicts, I think it's definitely, gonna happen unless the players just hate one method of doing things, in which case you shouldn't force them, that, they're gonna use both at some point. So that's not as important anymore, now that I know it's 9 chances to choose instead of 3. But, the rationale here, like, they fully have 7 strain left. And at that point, I would think you would want to. Like, you don't really need to get a little lucky. Like, the point where you need to get it done in relatively few attempts is, say if you were on 12 out of 17. Let's just say that. Because then you only have 5 attempts or so. And at that point, it would probably make more sense to go with force, because as long as you're like exploding drives properly, you can probably get it relatively quickly, whereas strain is more entirely like luck based. But if you were down to, like, I don't know, 16 out of 17 somehow, you would definitely want to go for skill, because that's the only way you would have a chance of surviving. Nothing that really matters. I just, I'm sort of talking about potential strategy and choosing between the two. It's not that in line with what is being said. Okay, values. Okay, that all makes sense. Still no success. Yeah, it's interesting the GM had it work at all for whatever reason. Okay, so here it is being described specifically as things improving. I think that's because the die size decreased, and potentially just because of a failing forward philosophy, and I think that's interesting to note. I did, notice that for force challenges, you should really say how things are improving as time goes on. But it looks like, you know, in addition, even for skill challenges, you should be describing how some ground is made as long as the die size increases or rather decreases. So, then that is something that definitely should be noted in the rules beforehand, I think, about describing things improving under certain circumstances, even when success is not met. It's a relatively extreme example. So, an extreme reaction to a simple choice. Four strain left, 3 extra dice as part of my push. It says here if they fail, then it's almost it. But if I recall, with Protect, strain decreases on failure. Let me go back and try and. Yeah, I'm going to have to go back a while, but. Effective push. Okay, yeah, roll up to 3 additional dice and choosing which single result to use. Lose 1 strain. I may be looking at something different. Let me see. This should be desire, if I'm right, which I very well might not be. Okay, yeah, so desire. And they say, if I fail, well, I guess that's almost it for Hannah, but, in the text of pushing desire, it says, on a failure, they lose 1 strain for each one. Maybe it's supposed to be they gain 1 strain for each one on a failure, because, the thing that's a problem is strain increasing. Yeah, so losing 1 strain, I think they, based on the example and also potentially how you can interpret that wording, that's supposed to mean, you know, strain happens to you as a bad thing, but, taking a literal reading of it, you would be decreasing the value, which would be a good thing. So, how this rule is actually supposed to read is you get advantage, up to 3 additional dice. However, if that advantage does not cause you to succeed, you gain strain for each die that you added. So there's a risk reward there that in a literal reading of the rules just isn't really there. Because it says you lose strain on a failure, not gain it. Okay. I don't know if that was a 50% chance or lower, but that was definitely probably a fairly reckless thing to do considering circumstances. However, if you were truly almost about to exhaust all of your strain, it would probably be the only move. Drive, she marks off a drift, increases. Okay, so that stacks. That's good to know. There's a success. Amy and Kevin. Why only Amy and Kevin? Because I think I've mistaken something. So right now, we have 3 players, one of who is the GM. So we have Amy, who is desire, Kevin, who is values. Okay, it has always just been desire and values. For some reason, I thought there was a third pillar that was being used in this example of play, and I thought there must be special rules where you have a player playing multiple pillars when you have few players, but no, that's not something that happened. I just confused the example, so everything's fine here. Though it is worth noting, um, yeah, it seems like things just become easier the more players you have, right? Because that's the more drives that can be marked off. It doesn't affect strain, but the more players you have, the more drives you get. So that makes things slightly easier. Because, the. I can't remember the term, but whatever bad thing that got the drift on drives will be reached less quickly with a larger pool of players. So that makes things slightly easier with more players, but probably not in a way that affects things too much overall. Who knows? Okay. So the thing about this is you would have to choose, your drive to get its third drift. So the question of is that ever really worth doing? Okay. And it looks like, though it is one pillar being threatened directly, all players work together to try to overcome it, perhaps. Okay, and you start with the best. And subsequent rules are always worse. There's no way, it looks like, to affect this with drive. So, it all comes down to luck at that point. Maybe you can still push, though. Okay, broken memory, but it doesn't say what that does. Okay, affects the hollow. And the drive is inverted. Okay, and a broken drives add drift to another randomly selected drive on another pillar, which I think is a fairly interesting way to do things and does allow the potential of echoes occurring randomly. In light of that, it might be a good idea to have a chance of a drive starting inverted, or a risk reward to choosing a drive to be started inverted, because that would allow there to be a chance for someone to randomly encounter an echo instead of choosing to from the beginning. But with only, 3 chances, it does seem like it would be very easy. It would be very easy to fail an echo. And, that doesn't instantly kill you or anything, it just has an effect down the line. Okay, so it is supposed to be ongoing during a conflict and mostly affect one pillar, but it looks like players are still taking turns on that echo anyway. Very interesting. Okay, so it is only by the pillar who created the memory, which I was thinking it might be. But overall, players as a whole are making the choice of how it's going to be resolved. And players start by rolling the best die. So the wording really makes it seem like multiple players are acting doing an echo, even though it's only one. So that wording should probably be corrected. Okay. The action of doing so mirrors the resolution of a mundane conflict and is played out in turn order alongside one in action, removing the pillar from it. That's also something, if I'm understanding this right, that's also something I considered whether the echo was going on during the conflict. The affected player's turn is spent resolving their own echo, rather than contributing to the conflict at hand. Okay, the GM initiates an echo and play on that turn, even if the current conflict has come to an end. It's good that that is established. The question is, what happens if, the encounter ends? Does it all switch to just resolving that echo, or is the echo automatically resolved at that point? Yeah, that does sound fun. It really does still seem like it would be hard for echoes to come about naturally, since they seem so easy to predict. Okay, multiple drives can reach their drift at the same time. And play out the echoes one at a time. Okay. Again, it doesn't really say what happens to echoes when a encounter overall resolves, but maybe that will be mentioned eventually. Okay, and no drive or push. It's good that that's officially being established. Alright, the affected player chooses skill of force, so it's definitely all one player acting everything out. I think why it's in the plural here is, to not single out a specific player, because you don't know who that player is going to be, but it should really be an affected player instead of players for stuff like this, or something along those lines. The player then describes the action their pillar embodied in this mind space, however the player wants, and rolls the best die size depending on the resolution type. Yep. Succeeds, then the echo is resolved, and drift is reduced to 0. If the roll fails, okay, add to their fracture. Everything, in terms of the rules and stuff, seems to be going really good so far. The way conflicts are role played out also is conducive to them being interesting without the burden being on any one individual player to make things interesting or, good story-wise. I think potentially there might be a bit of an issue with memories that, each player has to go through their own memory. Other than drives, each player does their own memory. They seem pretty much entirely improvised. And other than drives, they don't necessarily have a huge effect on things overall. But I think that'll come back into play. But, that comes back into play in echoes, and probably will in the final conflict. It's very hard for me to find any major flaws with any part of this system. So I'm just saying the balance might be a little off because you go through so many memories compared to each encounter. And the example memory doesn't really make them sound super interesting, or rather, this example memory doesn't really. So that's just, a little something to note. And we're back to the hollow and the persona. After the completion of the courier's third encounter, but before they reach civilization and complete their delivery, they will be faced with the hollow. Okay, constructed from broken memories, which I suppose makes it kind of awkward if they don't have any. Okay, so I maybe didn't actually read the example of an echo. I need to go back and do that. Yes, the cleansing waters of R. So I think ideally, the example of an echo would be drawn from the example of a memory that was created before. Because that makes it very easy to see how the memory correlates to the echo. Okay, 5 out of 16. If any sort of describe things not going well or getting worse. Yeah, another way more players makes it easier is that the more players you have, the more time between echo turns there are, which if echoes are resolved by the end of encounters, definitely helps things. Yeah, personally, I would like the example of play to be fully completed for the echo. You might skip over other players' turns, like just have notes that, the other players dealt with the actual problem while this echo was continuing, but I would like to see the echo resolved in this example. Yeah, if you're going to have something like this, you definitely want the chances of echoes to occur to be increased. Because right now it does seem largely up to the players to prevent it by just not using drive a third time on a specific drive. Okay, appearance and animus, and determines the number of conflicts based on broken memories. Okay, and health effectively is determined by remaining memories as well as self-image. Looks as normal. If successful, courier completes the journey and the players create a final memory, revealing their motivation for becoming a courier. If unsuccessful, the courier still completes their journey, but this memory will not be created, leaving the courier's story unfinished. So I don't really think that's a good way to do things. Them, I like completing the journey anyway, but I would think the focus should be on a little more of a, how that career changes and what happens to them and, how they get quote unquote worse rather than just leaving things unresolved. That seems, kind of just generally unsatisfying and doesn't fully take advantage of the interest that having a corrupted character can create, particularly when that corruption is supernatural in origin. And once again, it's not really mentioning anything about the message itself. And for couriers, that I would think would be especially important since, unless you have nothing waiting for you back home, you'll also need to take another journey for the return trip. Which is, an element that I don't think needs to be part of the game, but should at least be acknowledged that that's a thing. Alright. So I've read all of this. My one concern is the number of conflicts being divided by the number of broken memories versus number of players. That doesn't really make sense, because ultimately the more players you have, the less broken memories there are going to be, because the number of drifts that strain can be spread out across. And even in the case of, even ignoring that, like if you say have 2 players and 2 broken memories, I do think it makes sense for there to be 2 conflicts in that case instead of 1 conflict, especially since fracture resets anyway, making the number of conflicts not as directly increase the difficulty. Now, the amount of fracture being available being divided by the number of players makes sense, because, there are going to be much more memories overall, and specifically much more unbroken ones, if, there are more players. That said, I'm not sure what the adding 1 needs to be there for when you're rounding up anyway. Like, if you were rounding down, I would get the add 1 to make sure you have 1 at a baseline, but you're gonna have 1 as a baseline anyway. And if you have enough broken memories, like if you only have 1 unbroken memory, which is the only way you would have, a result of 1, I think having 1 fracture at that point would be fine, because that would mean even with 2 players, you would have 6 broken memories somehow. So, I think it's definitely fine to not have the add 1 there as long as you're rounding up. This, I do think, is off, though. 2 players. Number of broken memories, 1 conflict, 4 fracture. So let me see. If you have 1 broken memory, you have 1 conflict because the rounding, but you have 4 fracture. Well, I guess because, so total there would be, at that point, I believe 5 unbroken memories. You divide that by 2. That would put you down to 2.5, which would be 3 based on rounding, and then you get 4.
So I guess that does sort of make sense for the add one there, because you want to have a fairly lenient encounter if they only have one broken memory, I would think. But then from 2 to 3 broken memories, well, actually, no, conflict increases there, so stepping up only -1 fracture, another step up, and you get 2 conflicts, which, increases the chance of failing one of them, but still 3 fracture. Now, in either of these categories, you would have. So for this one, you'd have 4 unbroken memories. This one, you'd have 3. Either way, rounding, you get to 2 plus the 1. So the round up and add 1, I think, really works for this set of categories, at least. Okay. So yeah, that seems to make sense overall. Let's see. So you have 5 broken memories. That would be divided by 2, round up, that's 3. You have 1 remaining memory that you divide by 2, round up, plus 1, so you get 2, yeah. So I think, the rules really make sense. I know I questioned the adding 1, but I think this is fairly good difficulty scaling for 2 players. Let's see if that consists over the other examples. I'm not going to bother rechecking the math, I think, for most of these, since I did it for this entire category and it was fine. So, 1 conflict. Like already, it looks like we're in an easier state with an increased number of broken memories. And I do think the way the rules are written at present, there will actually, despite the larger number of overall memories, there's actually likely to be less broken memories the more players you have. So this, that isn't ideal. The scaling is more lenient for more players. Yeah, and with increases, there are no changes for difficulty for this at points. Yeah. So I would say the rules as written make relative sense for 2 players and start making less sense the more players you have. Like up to 3 broken memories, it's still incredibly easy with 4 players, and there's really just no reason for that I can see. So the rules definitely need to be modified for any other amount than 2 players. And I think overall the Echo's rules should be changed so that they're easier to encounter, because they're a huge part of the system, but they don't seem that hard to avoid, especially with more players. Hold on, Persona proceeds. Force of skill. Rules for Echoes to resolve each conflict. Okay, so you start with the highest. Yeah, so having this climax of the game being something that can be skipped entirely is probably not a great way of doing things. I also think using Echo's rules here is maybe a little too unlenient, because you can't take advantage of drives, and at minimum you've only got 4 attempts to win, basically. You do start with the biggest die size, though. And let me look at the difficulty values for this. Yeah, the Hollow and the Persona. Okay, la la la.
Not finding the thing. I know it's there that tells you the values for this, unless I'm wrong. Yeah, it might have just been defined in echoes and isn't redefined here. Okay, yeah, I think so. So 2 and 2 skill, force 16. I would probably change that a bit and restate it just for convenience. So at the easiest level, if you use skill, you've got a 50% chance of success on the first attempt. Then maybe let's say a third of a chance on the second attempt, a fourth of a chance on the fourth attempt. So overall, for skill, you've got a solid chance of success at the easiest level. A slightly less solid one with 3, but still not bad. I do appreciate that the fracture always decreases before the number of conflicts increases. I think that is a good thing that should probably be preserved, even if you do end up altering the way difficulty works. Now, I think it was 16 for force. So you start with a d12, so you get 6. Then you move down to a d10, so you get 5, that's 11. Move down to a d8, that's 4, that's 15. Now move down to a d6, that's 3. Yeah, so you definitely could make it with, force on this. But using average values, it's not that likely. It's not technically average, I know. Like, the average of a d4 is technically going to be 2.5, not 2. If I remember right, I'm not all that great. Let me just double check that. 3, 6, 10. Divided by 4. Yeah, so it should be 2.5. So technically I was lowballing it a bit there. But it does seem like the likelihood of success with force is a lot lower for echoes in the final conflict. Like, the whole advantage of force is you're sort of guaranteed success over time, but when the time limit, or the number of attempts limits rather, is much lower, that comes into play less. So I think maybe you should lower the force threshold a bit. Because skill 2, relatively reasonable to get within, a certain number of attempts. The force 16 is not terrible, but it does seem like it's less likely. Again, I'm not great with math, so I can't be sure, but I would say with a threshold of 16, skill seems like a generally better option for echoes. That said, narratively, it is kind of, very different because you get closer each time instead of things getting less likely each time. Rather, with echoes, where your die size is decreasing, you get, it's more even, because even though the die is going down, the amount you have stored up is going up. Alright, that's the echo. Summary, and then the hollow and preserve play. 6 total memories, 3 of 6, so yeah, divide, and how many players? Yeah, I think that's 2 people still. So that's, yeah, 2 conflicts or whatever, and then I think 3 fractures. Yeah, okay. That checks out. Yeah, personally, I'd probably go through something more human-like for the persona, but that's, more me. That's down to personal choice, not something about the rules. Skill and using the echo rules that will work together. If they do, complete a journey. 1 final memory. Yeah, I think it's more interesting to have a final memory that, is just twisted based on who changes. But that's, that might be a personal thing. Okay, yeah, first end potentially is becoming a casual of the race. So I think this ending section does need a lot more work. Like, I think there should still be a final memory, but it should be twisted, personally. For this, since this memory is going to be different, everyone's working together. It's not going to be focus on one pillar than everyone else being an NPC. There needs to be more guidance on how creating that memory plays out. And I think, obviously, yeah, you become a casualty of the waste, but it's worth mentioning that that can happen a lot of different ways. A player could be lost forever, physically lost, as in they don't know where they are. They could be killed by some kind of creature or natural effect, or potentially they could even be twisted and mutated by the waste. So here you should talk more about, describing how that casually actually happens. You should define the differences in role playing this kind of memory versus the normal memories. And this is, the ending is very important. You should very at least have an example for this ending, the best ending. And if the courier fails, yeah, like this, I would do this a different way, but that one is the least important one, potentially. Like, if you don't agree with that it's more important to have a twisted memory than no memory at all for the game to be satisfying. If you don't agree with that, then this is fine as is. But the other ones, I think, need more details, and this one should also have an example of play. And, still, there is no mention of what the message actually is, which I do think is important. There's some connection to actually being a courier instead of just someone traveling or wandering the waste. Because, for the premise of the game, according to the premise of the game, you specifically have to be delivering a message. And since that's part of it, I think, there should be something in the game that relates to that.
because otherwise it could be any kind of person traveling the waste, and the courier detail would be completely unimportant. And this definitely establishes the motivation, but it's clearly not a full memory that was role played by multiple parties, so it's very much not an example of play per se. It's nice that there's at least something there that pertains to a reason. Yeah, like if it's a group document, you're probably going to need more than one paper or a rather large poster rather than just a single sheet. Yeah, fairly standard equipment, but also this equipment gets more detail as memories happen in theory. Okay, drift clears at the end of encounters. This is the first time this has been mentioned, I'm pretty sure. And that is hugely important. Like, it might not actually be the first time it's mentioned, but I tried to check whether it mentioned it was reset earlier, and it didn't. Okay, and now let's use the terminology clear to search, since that was also used. Okay, drift is cleared after an encounter. Okay. So, this I very much don't agree with. It is already pretty hard to get a broken memory, and, you're getting more drifts each memory. So there's no reason that they should clear, in my opinion. That's like a. And that needs to be marked out very clearly because it's hugely important. Like, I don't know if that's even restated in the drift thing itself. And, just the terminology of using cleared instead of reset, whereas it's reset for everything else, is adding additional confusion that doesn't need to be there. But anyway. Endings, carrier, pillars. Right, and moving on to setting. Like, it is funny that they also state that drift clears, but they don't state that fracture does here for some reason. Before I go on to the world stuff, I want to just talk about some of my thoughts now. So, generally, I think it's a very good, relatively complete game, with a lot of interesting stuff to it. My opinion overall is pretty positive, but there are definitely some areas where things need to be changed. Like, there's a lot of minor writing stuff, like that one drive push being described wrong. That player instead of the next player. The formatting making skill challenges look like
tenses 30 instead of 3 at first, stuff like that, and not stating that you roll under and match the value rather than just roll under. Like, some minor writing changes need to be, like, changed. There's also the issue of the messaging, not the message that the courier carries, not really mattering to the setting at any point. Not mattering to the game at any point or the narrative at any point, despite the fact that, without that message, they would not be a courier. So it kind of seems like that should be an important part of the game if they are definitively supposed to be couriers and not just some form of traveler. Yeah, the setting, I haven't gotten into setting information yet, but the setting also doesn't seem that well worked into the narrative or mechanics, which is potentially fine, but given that it seems like you've written a lot for it, you might want to encourage players to incorporate that in some way. Then the next thing is the way drives work is like the way the whole ecosystem works is the main flaw of the game, I would say. Like, the rest of the stuff I mentioned is minor, but the drive stuff definitely, or rather echo stuff definitely needs to be focused on, because every time you use a drive, you get 1 point to it, and if you get 3, you encounter an echo, but you can just choose not to do that, choose not to activate that third. It is not stated what happens when encounters end before echoes, and that's another thing that can be exploited if ending an encounter ends an echo. And the fact that drift is reset at the end of encounters is also a problem, because you get more drives the more memories you get. So you can just spread your drift across multiple drives and never encounter an echo that way, which is also a pretty big problem, given that the final climax as a whole is determined by what echoes you've encountered, what drives and memories have been broken. Yeah, and that player number issue comes into play in the finale again, even if, like, despite the fact that the more players there are, the more drives there are, with no increase in difficulty, and therefore the more ways to avoid getting a echo while still abusing drives is possible. But in addition to that, once you get to the finale, the more players there are, the easier things get per the number of broken memories, despite the fact that there will likely be less broken memories if you have more players. So that's another issue. I really like I like the skeleton for all of it. I don't think you need to radically change the system. You just need to make it show drift probably doesn't need to reset. It should be a little more random when people get echoes. Like, maybe one drive starting out inverted, or not necessarily starting out inverted, but starting out so that it adds to someone else's drive randomly, could allow for more randomization in that department. Because, that's already a system in the game that you could use to increase randomness, which might be easier than creating a new system entirely. And then it also difficulty needs to be adjusted by players, because right now there's no difficulty increase, and it is overall easier to not get echoes, and then that changes the difficulty of the finale. So, you probably get the point at this point. I think the echo system is good, but it needs to be changed so that the climax is more likely to happen, so that more players don't make things roundly easier, and so you can't just choose effectively whether a memory of yours gets broken or not by just not using that drive a final time in a conflict and even getting to just let it reset. Yeah, there's also maybe a minor issue with memory versus conflict balance, given that, especially with more players, there are so many more memories than conflicts that, that sort of might bog things down a bit. But like I said, overall, I think it's a very interesting, well designed system. It's just that, the likelihood of echoes happening and the difficulty in various points around echoes really needs to be adjusted. Alright, I'm pretty much done at this point, probably, which is good because, this has taken. I've had to stop and start a lot more than usual for whatever reason, and that's been kind of annoying, but anyway, I'll probably mostly been skimming this since it doesn't seem that well worked into the system itself. Yeah, this seems to be a good spread of environments, I think. I think these are a lot of cool creatures. People. It's interesting that that's the term, and that seems like that's literally in the title of the game, but it seems to have so little influence on anything that actually happens in the game. Okay, looking at this. Right, another thing I forgot to mention that's sort of an overall flaw is, problem solving being described as important in the beginning, but not really coming into play, I don't think. Like, you don't really solve problems, you just make narrative choices. And that ends up in a problem being solved in game, but there's no IRL problem solving. Like here, I'm mostly trying to see if there's anything about the message itself in any of the advice section, but it didn't look like there was. Alright. So overall, I like this game a lot. I can't really tell if there are additional problems I've missed that would be come up in play, or if maybe some of the things I think are problems wouldn't present themselves as problems in play, but I do think there definitely needs to be adjustment to the echo system.